Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk a little bit about one of my favorite aircraft companies in World War II, and that is none other than Blohm and Voss, largely because they're just a gold mine of fascinating and bizarre design proposals. A little while ago, I made a video on their P-192 design, a proposed dive bomber that was supposed to replace the legendary Ju-87 Stuka, and it was rather bizarre looking in that the engine and propeller were located in the very middle of the plane behind the cockpit, sort of making it look like it had a necklace. Now, I specifically picked this design to make a video about because I thought it was the weirdest looking, but that design was not their only attempt to replace the Ju-87 Stuka, not by a long shot, in fact. For the planes that I could find any substantial information on, including the P-192, they had at least 8 proposed dive bombers and/or Stuka successors, and it's these planes that I want to talk about today. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about Blohm & Voss's first challenger to the Stuka, and specifically challenger, not successor, as back in the mid-1930s, Blohm & Voss was actually a competitor in the original design competition that resulted in the Ju-87, and their proposed design here was both innovative and oddly familiar in their HA-137. At the time of this design competition, Blohm & Voss was very early into their aircraft production career, having just started their aircraft wing in mid-1933. Up to that point, Blohm & Voss was known as a ship company, and this was their attempt to expand, and they would open the Hamburger Aircraft Factory as a subsidiary. Their first 2 attempts to break onto the scene in the HA-135 and 136 ended up amounting to very little, as the 135 was a basic biplane, and the 136 was a trainer that ended up failing due to an alteration in the Luftwaffe's plans. While these 2 planes were busy amounting to very little for them, in the Blohm & Voss company, a man named Richard Vogt would be hired to design for them. Vogt, himself a German national, had spent the past few years working over in Japan with Kawasaki, designing aircraft for them, before then returning to his home country to look for work. This new hire would give Blohm & Voss the necessary experience that they needed for their new aviation wing, and with the knowledge of the Luftwaffe searching for a new dive bomber design, Vogt and company elected to throw their hat into the ring, with a single-engine monoplane design that mimicked a previous Kawasaki project of Vogt's in the Ki 5, and this design would be the HA-137. Measuring in at 9.45 meters long, 11.5 meters wide, and 2.8 meters tall, the HA-137 clearly resembled the Ju-87 that it was competing against. However, this similarity appears to actually just be incidental and not intentional, or at least as far as I could tell, featuring inverted gull wings with short landing gear in an effort to increase landing gear strength, reduce drag, and presumably to not have to include gear to retract the wheels. Initially, it was to be outfit with a Pratt & Whitney Hornet radial engine, with around 600 horsepower. But upon first flying in early 1935, it was found that the wider radial engine ended up reducing the pilot's vision in a dive, which was not ideal for a dive bomber. The engine was then swapped out for a Rolls-Royce Kestrel inline engine, and later a UMO 210, also an inline engine with around 600 horsepower. With this new engine, the top speed sat upwards of 205 miles an hour, and it was armed with 4 forward-firing guns, either 4 7.92mm machine guns or 2 machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, to go along with a bomb load of 440 pounds. While overall these performance specs were pretty solid for a mid-1930s dive bomber where top speed isn't terribly important, the HA-137 ultimately lost out to the Ju-87, likely for two reasons. One was the Ju-87's maximum bomb load of 1,100 pounds, being more than double the 137. The other was the fact that Junkers was just a more experienced and well-established company. While I'm unsure if this was ever explicitly stated, the fact that the requirements for the Luftwaffe's dive bomber project just so happened to be altered midway to exactly fit what the Ju-87 offered them, it isn't hard to read between the lines there. Junkers was a known commodity, and so they would likely be more reliable and able to scale up production. But due to the HA-137's solid forward armament, the Luftwaffe did briefly give it a chance as a ground attacker, although this too amounted to very little, thus ending Blohm Voss's first competitor to the Stuka. After this failure, Blohm Voss went away from the whole Stuka dive bomber concept for a little while, instead investing more in seaplanes and flying boats and asymmetric planes and the like. But roughly about midway through World War II, with the Stuka still performing well, but starting to get up there in age, the Luftwaffe would start to look for a potential replacement, and Blohm Voss seemed to be rather eager to be that successor, perhaps as a sort of revenge tour for losing the first design competition. These are several of their proposed designs, varying in philosophy and viability. These are the Blohm Voss P168, P178, P193, P194, P196, P204, and BV237. Now, instead of going in chronological order or numerical design number order, instead we'll go in the order of how viable I think each of these designs would have been. Spoiler alert, none of these designs were ever actually made, so we'll have to make an educated guess on their viability. And how viable you think each of these designs may have been may differ from what I think, and that's perfectly fine. But with that in mind, we'll start with the proposal that I think was the most viable, in the BV237. All the way back in 1937, Blohm Voss embarked on easily their most iconic design ever in the BV141, probably more commonly known as that asymmetric German plane, designed in response to the Luftwaffe's call for a single-engine recon plane that emphasized pilot vision. Richard Vogt envisioned a very unconventional aircraft that would have the cockpit separate from the rest of the main fuselage. On the left or port side of the plane would be the engine, the propeller, and the tail section, and on the right or starboard side would be the cockpit, more akin to a wing-mounted pod. While at first glance, this layout would seem to lead to an issue of asymmetric thrust and just the plane being overall unbalanced, according to Blohm Voss's studies of such a concept, their 141 design would actually be more balanced than a more traditionally designed single-engine prop plane. As you can see in this diagram, on a normal single-engine plane, the torque of the engine and the spinning of the propeller causes the plane to trend or roll or turn to one side. But according to Blohm Voss, their setup on the 141 would perfectly counter this tendency, as the drag and weight from the cockpit pod would end up balancing out that trending to the side. And as they would discover in the actual flight testing of the 141, with the added effects of small trim tabs on the control surfaces, the asymmetric design proved to be pretty solid. However, regardless of offering the pilot great vision for a single-engine plane, the 141 still lost its design competition to the twin-engine FW-189, and in total, just under 30 BV-141s would be made. Despite losing its competition, the successful flights of the BV-141 prove that the asymmetric aircraft concept was viable, and on a plethora of Blohm Voss designs, Richard Vogt tried his damnedest to get one of them accepted by the Luftwaffe and Reich Air Ministry. One such design was the BV-237, which appears to be a direct successor to the BV-141. Measuring in at 10.75 meters long, 14.46 meters wide, and 3.3 meters tall, the 237 was effectively a scaled-down version of the 141, being smaller length and width-wise by roughly 3 meters. The 237 was to be powered by a BMW 801 radial engine, just like the 141 had, with 1,750 horsepower. Blohm Voss would propose two variants of this design, a dive bomber Stuka replacement with a crew of 1, and a pure ground attacker with a crew of 2. On the Stuka version, the 237 would be equipped with two forward-firing 15mm cannons and two rear-firing 13mm machine guns, to go along with a maximum of 2,200 pounds of explosives held under cockpit and under wing. On the ground attacker version, there would be an additional 3 forward-firing 30mm cannons, and the bomb load was in turn reduced to 900 pounds. The top speed of the 237 was projected to be a solid 360 miles an hour. However, for what it's worth, I do think it would have been a little bit lower than that. There was another proposed version of the 237, known as the B-1, that would have a Junkers Umo 4 jet engine just sort of slapped underneath it, right in the middle. It is with this extra propulsion that I suspect the 360-mile-an-hour top speed would have been more likely, and without that jet engine, I feel the top speed would have been closer to 300 miles an hour. Still, all things considered, quite solid for a dive bomber. With the completion of a full wooden mock-up sometime in late 1942 or early 1943, the design was actually ordered to begin production sometime starting early 1943, but for some reason this production never started. After several delays caused by Allied bombing raids, work was intended to ramp back up sometime by mid-1945, but due to the changing war situation that now called for interceptors and fighters, a new dive bomber design was just no longer in the cards, and as a result, the project would come to an end. Judging the 237 based on the solid flight performance of the BV-141, it probably would have been a pretty solidly flying plane, with a bomb load that was double that of the Ju-87D variant, and it would have a better forward armament to boot. In all likelihood, the 237 probably would have been a perfectly fine dive bomber. Next up, for what may have been the second most viable Stuka successor, is the P-193 pusher prop design. Constructed in parallel of the P-192 mid-body prop, the 193 was a more conventional approach to the idea of giving the pilot better forward vision with a single propeller-powered engine. Instead of offsetting the engine like Blohm Voss loved to do, they instead buried the engine in the fuselage behind the pilot and extended the propeller shaft out to the tail, making it a pusher-prop plane. The 193 design was a bit smaller than its 192 counterpart, measuring in at 10.3 meters long, 11.4 meters wide, and 3.9 meters tall, but with a proposed armament of 2 to 4 30 mil cannons and 2 20 mil cannons, along with a max bomb load of 2,200 pounds. This would make it equal to, if not greater than, the 192 in overall ground attacking offensive capabilities. But like the 192 design, the 193 never made it past the drawing board. But I still think it would have been potentially a pretty solid plane. If we use the Dornier DO335 as reference, that also used a pusher tail prop and a buried engine, the 193's engine and propeller setup probably would have been fine. The thing that does give me pause, though, would be the fact that the propeller drive shaft would have to be much longer on the 193 than it was on the DO335, which would add some complexity and would be a potential weak point. But aside from that, the 193's design wasn't terribly wacky, so it was overall pretty viable. For the third most viable design, we have another one that for the most part was pretty conventional looking, in the P-196, a twin-boom jet-propelled dive bomber. Visually speaking, it looked quite similar to something like the P-38 Lightning, and it wouldn't be surprising if Blohm Voss took some inspiration from the American design. Measuring 11.75 meters long, 15.3 meters wide, and 3.25 meters tall, the P-196 was roughly similar in size to the P-38. But different from the P-38 was the cockpit location, the propulsion method, the horizontal tail surface location, and the landing gear, to name just a few things. With the 196 being a dive bomber, and with the intent of improving pilot vision, the cockpit was moved to the very front of the nose. Just under the pilot would be a clear panel so he could see below him. And this was because the landing gear was not tricycle like on the P-38, but more standard with small tail wheels, meaning that pilot vision would be more obstructed while they were on the ground. Directly under the fuselage and under the pilot would be the engines, a pair of BMW 3 jet engines with just under 2,000 foot-pounds of thrust each. Because of the location of these engines, the horizontal tail surface had to be raised to keep them out of the path of the exhaust. But in having two jet engines, Blohm Voss would project a blistering top speed upwards of 553 miles an hour. The armament of the P-196 was more akin to just a broad ground attacker, with an armament of 2 20-mil cannons and 2 30-mil cannons in the nose, along with potentially extra guns in each of the wing booms. Carried inside those wing booms, in 2 small bomb bays, would be a combined maximum of 2,200 pounds of explosives. While all of its combined specs were incredibly promising, and the general design was pretty sound, and a lot more normal than your typical Blohm Voss plane, I think the problem here lies in the location of the engines. Having them both directly under fuselage then forces the bombs to be held in those smaller bomb bays in the booms. This ends up restricting the size of the bombs that the design could carry in them. Unless they wanted to attach the bombs directly to the engines, the 196 probably wouldn't be able to carry larger single 2,200-pound bombs, and instead that weight would have to be reached with much smaller bombs. This restriction was pretty unnecessary, and probably the smarter option here would have been to put the engines in the wing booms, and then have the bombs stored in the larger and more roomy main fuselage in the center. But other than that issue, it was probably still a pretty decent design. For the number 4 probably most viable design would be a return to form for Blohm Voss with an asymmetric design in the P178. Essentially, the 178 was if the BV-141 was powered by a jet instead of a piston engine. While the asymmetry on the P178 was not as severe as it was on the BV-141, the main fuselage, which housed the pilot, and a pair of tail-mounted rockets to help in takeoff, it was slightly offset to the port side, and on the starboard side sat a single UMO-4 turbojet, with around 2,000 foot-pounds of thrust. The armament for the 178 was more on the light side, with just two 15mm machine guns in the nose, and under fuselage would be a recessed bomb bay with room for up to 2,200 pounds of explosives. The problem in this design was that the whole asymmetric concept was kind of pointless for a jet-powered plane. There was no propeller that would get in the way of the pilot, and there's also the question of how much rotational torque the UMO-4 jet engine would have. Would that torque be similar to a propeller engine? And if not, would this then cause some asymmetric thrust in the 178 being an asymmetric plane? Simply put, the 178 design had more questions that needed answering, thus making it less viable. Now, for the third least viable plane, we've got another asymmetric design in the P194, which at first glance bore a strong resemblance to the 141 and BV-237, and indeed the P194 was largely just a slightly larger version of the BV-237, but with one critical difference that I think raises a lot of questions. Under the starboard cockpit pod of the 194 would either be a UMO-4 or BMW-3 jet engine. Now, in a vacuum, the addition of this engine would significantly boost the potential top speed of the design, and indeed, the projected top speed with some fuel boosters was upwards of 444 miles an hour, and with an armament of two 30mm and two 20mm cannons, along with 2,200 pounds of explosives, the P194 presented an impressive combination of speed and power. But do recall how the 141 and 237's asymmetric designs worked, due to propeller torque, asymmetric thrust, and cockpit drag counterbalancing one another to create a solidly straight-flying plane. With the addition of another source of thrust under the cockpit, would that not, in some way, throw all of these forces off balance, making the plane trend in one direction or another, eliminating one of the benefits of an asymmetric plane? Plus, would the power difference between the normal prop engine and the jet engine not cause issues? I think there just would be too much to work out with this new design, and considering that it was designed sometime in early 1944, there just wasn't enough time to work all of that out. For our second least viable plane, we have another asymmetric plane, and another mixed power plane to boot, but one that I think is much dumber than the P194 in the P204. While this is technically an asymmetric plane, the fuselage is actually located in the middle of the wing like normal, and for the most part with a cockpit above the wing and a BMW 801 radial engine in the nose, the P204 looked pretty normal, almost kinda looked like an FW190, but under the port wing, a single BMW-3 or UMO-4 jet engine would be found, and with this engine, the projected top speed sat at 470 miles an hour. Now, not only does this whole engine setup eliminate the better pilot vision benefit of an asymmetric design with the radial engine being directly in front of the pilot, but you have the same problem with the P194 and that the engines have different power, and they would potentially then have issues with asymmetric thrust and the plane trending to one side or the other. Honestly, if the jet engine had been installed in the tail, like later mixed power planes tried to do, it would have been much more viable. But in this form right here, it makes me irrationally angry. But for our last and least viable plane, we have one that is so weird looking that it goes past making me angry and into being unintentionally hilarious, in the P-168, or what should be known as the final boss of Blohm Voss. I mean, honestly, just look at it. That's all I have to say, really. So, for these planes as a whole, at least for the more viable of them, their ultimate failure ended up having rather little to do with their potential as aircraft, and rather much more to do with the general war situation, and Germany just not needing new dive bombers or ground attackers at the moment. They needed interceptors and stuff to take out fighters and bombers flying over Germany, and Blohm Voss just kept on trying to replace a plane that was now pointless to try and replace. Realistically, somebody just needed to tell Blohm Voss to stop. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Now for the P-168 plane, I almost feel like Blohm Voss was just trying to see what they could get away with. Like they were trying to annoy the Luftwaffe and Air Ministry. And you know what? Good for them. The country was crumbling around them, so why not have some fun? I mean, who cares? But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.